Have you ever found yourself repeating some piece of family lore, only to realize that neither you nor anyone else remembers where the story came from or even what it means? Turns out that also happens in the Bible. There are passages, mainly stories, whose origins and original significance have been long forgotten. These are the kinds of passages that often leave us with way more questions than answers. The kind of passages that prompt us to say, "What?" Today's passage fits in this category nicely. There are several stories in that portion of Genesis that follow the life of Abraham, beginning in chapter 11 when he first appears on stage through chapter 25 when he dies, that evidently come from some very ancient sources, whose original significance got lost along the way. Today's reading comes from early in the Abraham stories. In it, God makes a covenant with Abraham, who is still known by his original name, Abram. The first part of the passage proceeds ordinarily enough, with a description of the conversation between God and Abram preparing a sacrifice for God. And though this kind of thing is far outside of our experience, we don't practice animal sacrifice anymore, we've read enough stuff like this that it doesn't strike us as particularly odd. The story goes, "Then God said to Abram, 'I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess.' But Abram said, 'O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it?' God said to him, 'Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon.' He brought him all these and cut them in two, laying each half over against the other, but he did not cut the birds in two. And when birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away." Now, this is where things get a little strange. There's a brief section where the sun goes down and Abram falls into a deep sleep. While Abram sleeps, God speaks to him in a dream, first to reassure him that he will be the ancestor of many, but also that they will be enslaved in another land for 400 years. Then we read this. "When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, 'To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates.'" The pieces here evidently refer to the halves of the animals Abram had set in place for his sacrifice to God. And what is clear from the context is that there must have been some very ancient practice, long forgotten, in which a covenant was ratified by passing things like a smoking pot or a flaming torch between portions of sacrificed animals. What does it mean? What does it signify? I don't have a clue, and anyone who says they do is really only speculating. No one knows where this comes from, for it appears nowhere else in the Bible, and as far as I know, there is little or no record about such a thing in other ancient sources. It is, in a word, a mysterious act done in the course of confirming a covenant. But for all the mystery surrounding this episode, one thing is crystal clear. It is God, and God alone, who acts to make this covenant. God is the active party, and Abram completely passive, emphasized by the fact that he's apparently still asleep when this happens. Most covenants in the ancient world were two-way agreements, whether the agreement was between equal parties or between unequal parties. In either case, both parties would ratify the covenant. But here, God establishes the covenant, and God alone ratifies it. This is powerful stuff. It is a bold reminder that in our covenant relationship with God, not only do we come into the relationship as subordinates, we come into it without having had to agree to it on the front end. It is all about God's grace reaching out to us, claiming us without any merit on our part in any way. This theme of unmerited grace is perhaps the single most important thread of the whole biblical narrative. Indeed, Paul constantly reminds his readers that salvation does not depend on our doing anything. Otherwise, salvation would depend on us, even to a minor extent, and the sacrifice of Jesus Christ would be null and void. Sometimes these passages that cause us to wonder hide the truth that is in plain sight. It is important not to let the what factor obscure the meaning of the text.